Good evening. It's the 6th day of Subversive Festival, and tonight we're going to listen to Gayatri Spivak. She's one of the authors that founded the post-colonial critical theory, and she finds herself to be a Marxist and a feminist, and that's very interesting for me. And one of her most well-known books is Can the Subaltern Speak?, in which she speaks of the sati, that it's a ritual that is done for women in India. And recently she published another book that's called An Aesthetic of Education in the Era of Global Education. No, in the globalized era.
It's called an aesthetic. Is this on?
Yes.
Yes. It's called An Aesthetic Education, which is the affirmative sabotage of Schiller. Aesthetic education in the era of globalization, but actually it's like Benjamin's globalizability. The Harvard editor thought the book wouldn't sell if I called it that. An aesthetic education in the era of globalization.
I will now leave you to her and enjoy.
Thank you. Oh. Thank you. It's a short introduction, so I didn't get the chance to actually collect my talk. Give me just a minute, and I'll put on my glasses, and I'll read my talk. Okay. It's called Futures, Pasts, Languages, and the Balkans. I first want to apologize for this title. With the advent of digital conferences, the request for titles and abstracts comes too soon for those of us who don't recycle and have been speaking in public for many years. I have been thinking about these questions, futures, pasts, languages, the Balkans, for a long time, so I put in everything in the title. You will. I'm sure many people know this problem. You will judge if I get close to it. I am here to learn. As Srečko knows, I tell him that all the time. I'm here to learn, not to give you instructions about the future of Europe. I have come here to share questions. I'm sorry I could not attend the Balkan Forum, because I hear that you have made plans, I think they're extraordinarily fine plans, frankly, to bring all of the left factions together. I think we really need to be together at this kind of time. I don't think there are correct lines at this point. So I'm very sorry indeed that I couldn't be there. I will, however, in my talk, say a few things about how this kind of effort to form a new collectivity, which is not really like a party formation, how to make this kind of thing last. What I'm going to talk about is not very glamorous, but it's very sincere. I'm 70 years old and I've been teaching full-time for 47 years. These suggestions come, and I teach at both ends of the spectrum, right? PhD students in English, French, and German literature at Columbia, and absolute children, elementary education in the poorest sector of West Bengal, landless peasants. So to an extent, the idea of how to make things last, which is not a glamorous enterprise, a lot of my talk will be about that. I am also involved with advising the occupiers of Wall Street. I'm not a solidarity tourist, okay? I don't kind of come forward to join. I mean, I love demonstrations because they're kind of because they're fun, frankly. And also, since I'm a green card holder in the United States, early on got the, and I don't go anymore in the United States, I do still go in India, I'm a citizen of India, we got the instructions early on as to how to avoid the police, because if you're a green card holder, you don't want to tangle with the police, they're going to kick you out of the country. But anyway, so that's fine, but I'm basically not a solidarity tourist. I go if I'm called upon. And the occupiers have called upon me a couple of times, and I have responded. And day before yesterday in Frankfurt, I spoke to the besieged city, where hundreds of police cars were protecting the city from its citizens, as you know, because they wished to blockify the citizens, the central and commercial banks. I was very moved by also the way just as I'm very moved by the effort in so-called post-socialist space to bring all of the left forces together to rethink yourselves. In the same way, I was very moved by the fact that in Frankfurt, what they did, the letters that they have written, etc., they're talking about, I quote, the importance of democratic minimum standards. This was an interesting thing to say. I mean, let me now make a distinction here, then I will go back into my paper. And as I'm saying, post-socialist space is different from what's happening in the rest of the world, as it were. We have much to learn from you. But at any rate, when they talked about the state in this way, what they were recognizing was, because in the United States, generally speaking, in the Occupy area, there is a kind of vague, untheorized anarchism, which is kind of a position, more Althusser than Gramsci, as it were, which is a position against the state, Foucault, governmentality, etc. It's not thought through. So I'm certainly not a statist, but on the other hand, what the Frankfurters are seeing is that the state is their main enemy, and therefore the thing to do is not just simply to let it go or oppose it, but really to win it back so that it's not just poison but also medicine. And to an extent, this Rosa Luxemburg-style notion of what happens with a triumphant general strike, which is what Luxemburg saw, is for me not in this area, but speaking from the United States and Germany and so on, and certainly India, it seems to me that this was an interesting way to go. You folks, once again, in the Balkan Forum, have been talking about labor, but this was not a labor kind of enterprise, and so I'll talk a little bit about that as well. As I was talking to the Frankfurters, I received an invitation from the Occupy Berlin group, and I probably will go. I have just spoken to Al Jazeera Arabic. Again, they asked me, and I was very honored having Arabic, about Western views on the Arab Spring. So I'm a non-European citizen. I don't know if among your keynotists you have another one, because Tariq is British. I'm a non-European citizen, and it matters, because identity is not your skin color or the way you look or the clothes you wear. It's the civil society that you inhabit. So I'm a non-European citizen from a state, I'm from West Bengal, where the left front government in power blotted its copybook and lost after 34 years only to give place to an absolutist woman who is censoring institutions of learning, displacing the poor, and imprisoning critical educators. So it's easy to say I'm a Marxist and a feminist, but these are complicated positions. I don't really say I'm either of anything. It was Colin McCabe, the British guy who had to write the introduction. You see, the editors are always interested in selling books, obviously. So he was asked to write a little introduction so I could sell my book, and that's what he called me. Anyway, so from a state where the left front government has lost after 34 years to give place to this absolutist woman. In Frankfurt and New York, I say, that labor is not the agent of this general strike. The general strike, I wrote a thing in Tidal, the Occupy Wall Street paper. They gave me, I should show you, they gave me a really massive picture where I actually argued this out. I argued out the way in which I think that it's the agent of the general strike has changed. So I say here, this, look at the picture they gave me. Okay, do I look like a person like this? But anyway, so in Frankfurt and New York, I say that rather than the end of imperialism, post-colonial digital multitudes or social networks, you talk about social movements in your conference description. Globalization, in fact, is a new stage of imperialism. When we celebrate social networking, I say to them, we must not forget that the telecommunication companies, China Mobile and Deutsche Telekom, were the first ones to break state control and privatize in that special way, crossing borders to encourage investment in foreign currencies, not necessarily located in their country of origin, thus changing the nature of the connection between the state and global capital, making the state serve capital rather than people located within its boundaries. Globalization, I say, in our neck of the woods, in our part of the world, information intensive and working at high electronic speed, has improved not only the seeming political possibilities of social networking, but also the possibility of trade in foreign exchange. The differences among hard currencies, you know, euro, dollar, and dollar, I'm sure you heard this in the previous talk, yen and dollar, the dollar and sterling, dollar and euro, all kinds of, among hard currencies and between hard and soft currencies, the currencies of the global north and the global south, minute, incessant, 24/7 because of heliocentric time, the world's time zones, hard to track electronic maneuvers. This finance capitalism, this is not all of finance capitalism, but the biggest sector, has a much higher daily turnover or circulation, which makes capital grow exponentially over against world trade. Already 10 years ago, US gross domestic product was less than 2% of the finance capital transaction volume. In addition to this, the so-called service industries have grown in volume over manufacturing as well. Electronic capitalism has also managed to pulverize the factory floor, which is a quote from Asia Labor Monitor, and made it impossible for labor-based general strikes to achieve more than limited and topical results. In Bangladesh, the country can be stopped with a general strike, but not in the US. This is one of the reasons, and of course they can easily say that Occupy Wall Street is not working as they did because on May 1 they couldn't bring the city to a halt. But this is not to realize that general strike for this crowd is not like Sorel, not in that way, but in a post-labor way, as it were, not empirical. At any rate, this is one of the reasons why the citizen-based, rather than the labor-based general strike, we won't move until our demands are met, that is Occupy Wall Street movement, and also what's happening in Frankfurt, fit the times. They fit the times. But it's not the same thing here. But here, the situation is different. If indeed the majority of the working class in post-socialist space instruct labor in the inequities of privatization, they would be invaluable to the rest of us. In other words, I'm not really thinking of the future of Europe, but the future of the world. I was, and indeed am closely associated with the work against privatization in the labor movement in Bangladesh. But if you think no one listens to the Balkans as a European voice, do you think anybody listens to Bangladesh as a global advisor? This is why my few words to you are not really about what you nostalgically in your conference description call the old continent, but rather today's newish world where some of us fight even against the metonymic continent think of Asia as India and China. Lenin, what is to be done, recommends vanguardism in the face of consolidated opposition from world imperialism. Even without the depredations of Stalinism, vanguardism could not lay the basis of a just society. At best, it built up a counter-imperialism, neither more nor less evil than any other, supported by state capitalism and a, quote, nationalist education. Although Lenin spoke of bringing the masses to full class consciousness, there was no time for this. And certainly the building up of a will to social justice, generation after generation, within the speed required by the ceaseless strategizing demanded in turn by the incessant workings of the vanguardist control of political economy, was not on the agenda. The emphasis was on explaining political information, not on an attempt to change habits of mind. And that really is the point. Unfortunately, people think that an informed collectivity is all that we need. This is perhaps interesting and good at a time when there is actual political oppression felt by a group that really wants to make change. But that is not the picture of a democratic world. Democracy is not just about the politically energized vanguard. It's not even about everyone. It's about anyone, even the jerks, people who are not interested in resisting, etc. So that this particular way of thinking social justice, willing social justice, not in a grand way, should become a kind of common sense for even those who are not in the vanguard. Otherwise, revolutions, as I say, are glamorous, but they do not last. I mean, I saw that already very much. You know, as I say, I'm 70 years old. I used to come to the Praxis International things in Yugoslavia regularly, year after year. And it really does seem to me, I could go on about some of the speeches I heard in Kosovo in last May. But at any rate, it really is not a question of giving political information, because in the long run, giving information is almost finally useless because it's more of the same. One certainly should have information as much as one needs, but the proliferation of statistics and information only to prove that capitalism is destroying us ultimately begins to justify itself as an end rather than a means. Without the general nurturing of the will to justice among the people, no just society can survive. The Occupy Wall Street movement, I said to them, must attend to education, primary through post-tertiary, at the same time as it attempts to the uncoupling of the connection between specifically capitalist globalization and the nation state. This is an almost impossible task to remember, especially when there are such complex and urgent immediate tasks lined up. But it must be repeated. Without this attention, there is no chance of survival, as we have seen in the case of the Soviet Union, China, and other post-revolutionary societies. This particular thing, you know, I graduated college in 1959, and I got tenure in 1970. So all through the 60s, I was a very good thing, either a graduate student or an untenured junior faculty, and certainly moved through the 60s, connected to movements, going on demonstrations, going to jail if I were in India, but also in the 50s, certainly not in the United States, and so on. But I will say this, that this particular idea that came up in the 60s, that somehow in the name of university reform, it was possible simply to say that anybody, all those teach-ins and so on, anybody could actually teach in that slow, unglamorous way that changes the shape of the mind, epistemological performance, how you construct objects for knowing. This, unfortunately, is incorrect. This is not something. I have a friend, she's 44 years old, who just ran a 56-kilometer marathon, okay? She had to take care of her body in a way that I cannot tell you. And we should not assume that the mind is less complicated than the body, especially if we agree that it is determined in a material way. And therefore, I think we really ought to think it through. The changing of universities is not just occupying space and so on and so forth. To change the structure of this thing that has lasted since the European Middle Ages is a much more complicated business, and changing the structure of the university is not the same as educating outside of the university. So therefore, or I say primary to tertiary, this is a very unglamorous thing. It's a back-breaking thing. It's time and skill. It's not something you can do in a glamorous way because you are out in the streets. It's not something that one can actually think about without feeling that this is, 19th century word, reformist or individualistic or some such thing, but I cannot tell you how important this is. Indeed, Mao Zedong tried to solve this problem by the once and for all solution of the Cultural Revolution, whereby he simply reversed the hierarchy that inhabited Chinese society, only to prove that without the patient and continuous system of education, the mind of a people cannot be nourished, and without robust mental resources, we are at the mercy of brainwashing and mind-fucking. Let me say that, you see, brainwashing is ideological production, and mind-fucking is, of course, epistemic violence. Let me say that in China, I've been learning Chinese now for 6 or 7 years, and I go to these mud schools, one room, one teacher, very remote, 3 or 4, near the Laos border. Last year, I've been doing this since 2000. Last year, as China is changing up above, I mean, I was also at Beida, I was at Tsinghua, etc., where all American academics go. It might as well be the United States. But in those areas, these teachers were talking to me about the will to socialism. I mean, they are so unlike what you look at in the newspapers, especially Wang, a woman in one of these schools to whom I became very, very close. She was saying that something pretty much like this, and some not really very sort of political. She was saying that, you know, in those schools, because they were small, now they're all central schools, and the number of students in the area where I go has dropped from 2,300 to 673, way down there. And half of it is privatized, but as the rubber plantations are privatized. But what these people were saying, and she's even written a little booklet for me, which I'm having translated. My Chinese is not that good. But she said that, you know, in those schools, what we were able to do is to put in the children a will for socialism, which is now going. In the central schools, you can't do that. I mean, this was amazing stuff, and, you know, I spent time there, nearly 2 weeks, and these conversations, to an extent, also echo the kind of stuff that I'm trying to say. The dismantling of the connection between the citizen and the state that we are now witnessing in the US context is basically a dismantling of the New Deal established by Franklin Roosevelt between the 2 world wars during the Great Depression brought about by a crisis of overproduction. Now, let me say this, that there is a knee-jerk reaction to this one. It is certainly true that the working class, enabled by the New Deal, went to fight in the Second World War, which was inevitably an imperialist war. To write off the welfare state as a result of this is like writing off socialism, because the German Social Democrats, at the time the most powerful social party in Europe, voted in war credits in 1914. So if you are sort of trained up to say, the moment one mentions the New Deal, oh yes, it was just for an imperialist war, you should think again. In 1976, when Reagan started bullying Gerald Ford, slowly the structure of the New Deal began to collapse until in 1999, and remember, I'm not talking about post-socialist space. You will teach me in that area. I am except for the mud schools in China, where I have some experience. But at any rate, what I'm talking about is the Arab Spring and Occupy Wall Street and so on. And there, in 1999, one of the laws that was repealed collapsed the difference between commercial banks and investment banks. And that's when really slowly the subprime crisis began to be able to take place until 2007, when, of course, it absolutely broke the economy to bits, and it affected the whole world. However, Roosevelt's Labor Secretary, Frances Perkins, was responsible for planning the New Deal in its detail. It was my great good fortune to live across the hallway from her as a graduate student at Cornell University in the 60s, in the honor society called Telluride House, where I was the first woman student to be given a lodging scholarship. Madam Perkins was the permanent faculty resident. We were the two women living in the house with 32 male undergraduates and 3 male graduate students, among them Paul Wolfowitz. I believe I can say that the idea of devising a welfare state in the United States could come so strongly and so effectively because it was in the hands of a supremely intelligent and feminist woman. Remember the Freedmen's Bureau in the middle of the 19th century, established after the emancipation of the slaves, a small welfare state that lasted for a few months in the South, was completely decimated because of racism. And here, on the other hand, because her class was secure, this feminist woman whose mother had told her, Frances, you're so ugly that you need to wear big 3-cornered hats. I mean, it's a pathetic thing. Anyway, she talked to me about how it was by being silent and letting the men in Roosevelt's cabinet claim credit. I mean, hardly anyone knows her name. This kind of thing could come about. And yet she changed the entire face of the United States. I do not believe that there is anything like an essence of women as nurturing or guarding us in some kind of emotional way. But on the other hand, it is true that one of the unintended consequences of keeping women separate from gainful employment, keeping them forcibly responsible toward other human beings all their lives, and idealizing them in polite society, historically produced in superbly educated, brilliant women a propensity towards other-directed behavior much more readily than in men of comparable class production whose ambition could take a self-directed path to success. Proto-feminism is quickly taking care of this, of course, and post-feminism. On the other hand, the idea that this kind of other-directed behavior can be learnt without gender compromise is also something that we must nurture apart from the formation of collectivities that will act on programmatically on actual problems confronting us. The future of Europe is not just now. The future is a long drawn-out, undecidable thing. The Reagan-Bush era in the United States, together with Thatcher's regime in the United Kingdom, saw the beginnings of the dismantling of the welfare state that we are witnessing today. In globalization, the sovereignty of the state is compromised as a result of the removal of barriers between national and international capitals. In the best concept of the democratic nation-state, the state's chief function is the redistribution of revenue for social welfare according to the Constitution. After restructuring, the state's role becomes managerial of capitalist globalization. You travel in Africa, and you folks are not talking about Africa at all, I see. You travel in Africa, and people on the left come forth and say, we have a new constitution. And here also, you hear about constitutional patriotism. In South Africa, you hear about a new constitution. But constitutions today are very much within quotation marks because of the managerial state. Thus, the state becomes accountable to business rather than to people. The predicament of the 99% versus the 1%, that's Occupy Wall Street. It goes without saying that this cannot be redressed simply from within the democratic electoral mechanism of a state. The law can forever be changed in favor of business rather than people if the entire polity is not educated to desire justice for all. And so even this emphasis on law, this somehow, again, wins that. I mean, remember, I'm talking about the other space. This emphasis on law wins the adjective reformist. So what I also say, and I will say that a little bit later, you heard the title of my book, Aesthetic Education. Aesthetic education for me is not the German 18th century. As I said, it is an undoing of the German 18th century, if you like. It is training the imagination for epistemological performance. In other words, you change the way you know the object of your knowledge. To an extent, when in Capital Volume 1, Marx was asking the worker to think not that he or she was the victim of capitalism, but the agent of production again and again. This is epistemological performance. You change the way, remember, I mean, this is something, of course, I don't need to repeat here. But that idea that actually it is the worker who does the stuff, the capitalist borrows and doesn't give back the whole thing, etc., Marxism 101. That, on the other hand, is an invitation. And if one looks at Rostolsky's book as to how carefully that book was put together, Capital One, this was indeed the invitation, which is why Gramsci thought, and I quote, that Marx's project was not just moral and psychological, but epistemological. I mean, moral and psychological, that's also rather funny, but that's Gramsci. But epistemological, you train your imagination so that you do not constitute either what you know or how you know yourself, you change it. That's really what is to an extent required. We need to change those 19th century labels by which we simply write off things that we do. To repeat then, the largest sector of global capital is finance capital. Finance capital is basically trade in foreign exchanges. The more often finance capital turns over or circulates, the more its volume increases. For financial globalization to work, the world must remain unevenly divided between the global south and the global north so that there can be constantly fluctuating differences in the value of hard currency and soft currency so that financialization can operate. The banks in all nation states are clued into this game and so must turn over money as often as possible, borrowing and lending fast and playing one sort of investment over against another. World trade turns over less often because it is connected to material goods and services, but world trade also has a very large futures trading sector that plays into finance capital. Since the Reagan-Bush era, the barriers between national capital, in the case of the United States, federal regulations, and this play of global capital have been slowly relaxed. As I mentioned, in 1999, the investment bankers could begin to serve as officers of commercial banks. They took control away from government-controlled enterprise and gave it over to global capital flows. This little thing, which is basically, I mean, the banks were not nationalized, obviously, in the United States, but there was this kind of government-controlled enterprise which went in 1999, and that really put the whole financial future of the world in another place. It is because of the demand that capital flow in and out as fast as possible that even when human beings were suffering and being beaten down into the 99%, as a result of the housing crisis, banks had to be, quote, bailed out so that they had enough funds to continue in the inflow and outflow of capital that makes finance capital turn over. The IMF regularly bailed out banks when nation-states were in debt crises. This is an inhuman and seductive game which needs to be controlled so that it can be medicine in the interest of social productivity rather than poison. Remember those of you who were in Dubrovnik last year when I said that capital is good and capitalism is bad. Someone said there, no, we don't understand this statement. And then it took 2 hours because people kept asking questions about this, and it was very amazing that this was not known there, so that I never got to say anything about feminism in the spirit on which I had prepared a speech. But at any rate, so as the U.S. General Accounting Office said in its generally ignored 2004 report on predatory lending, Now remember, the US General Accounting Office is hardly the left. So even they had this sense that that capital is both medicine and poison. You can build society by constant turning around, not by state capitalism, but regulated capitalism, so that you can constantly turn around capital for socialism if the electorate and the polity have a will to social justice. You talk about nationalist selfishness in your conference description. Selfishness is not a moral fault. Selfishness is to an extent the ground of a creaturely life. So in order to turn it around, there has to be a kind of education that puts in this artificial will to social justice into this. I'm not a Christian. There is certain kind of a Christian notion that the will to social justice comes out of suffering, even though it's not acknowledged as Christian. One has to look at this practically. But at any rate, to come back, the US General Accounting Office said, and I quote, "The secondary market, where previously issued financial instruments such as stocks, bonds, financial futures, and loans are bought and sold, may play a role in both facilitating and combating predatory lending." Facilitating predatory lending, the crisis, the subprime bubble, facilitating predatory lending, or combating predatory lending, medicine and poison, depending on knowing how to use. And I'm going to mention something here which may not be of any interest to you because it's too US-based, but it's worth mentioning. The connection with Washington comes clear if we look at the past few years when individual states fought bitterly, like Massachusetts, Wisconsin, fought bitterly to have some kind of regulation. And the federal government fought back strongly to squelch these efforts. We must also take into account the so-called non-banking financial institutions, insurance firms, pawn shops, cashier's check issuers, check cashing locations, currency exchanges, microloan organizations, and the like, which are free of any national and international regulatory efforts. In order to correct political economy, we cannot rely on politics alone, and we cannot behave like old-fashioned socialism alone, because one must also remember that international socialism failed because of a big ethics-shaped hole. And that's ethics was a dirty word. Believe me, it's also a dirty word among the mechanical Marxists in India. Someone rises up and says, "You lived in the United States too long. You are again a reformist, an individualist." My dear friends, like Amit Bhaduri and so on, who are excellent workers, but they cannot believe that the mind is a very complicated machine and an important instrument. They are, in fact, unrecognized, unacknowledged by themselves. They're idealists about the mind. They really make a clear analogy, and they just kind of let the mind work fancy-free because they think the mind is too strong. They do not believe that the mind, in fact, has to be tethered in a certain way to this kind of material will to justice, if anything is going to last, as I said. The idea, if you look at the Rosa Luxemburg's mass strike, there is a chapter, well, it wasn't really divided into titled chapters, but section 7 begins by saying that at the end of, remember this is before 1917, way before 1906, it was written right after the big general strike. She says that it would have lasted in Russia if there had been a civil society. Unfortunately, anyone who reads that book in English is completely thrown off because the word civil society is translated bourgeois. She certainly says bürgerlich, but she doesn't mean what the English word bourgeois means. And so it becomes a meaningless remark. But at any rate, this is what, to an extent, I'm also talking about. It's the same message here. The professional Indians will come and talk to you about, how the subaltern in India is having a Maoist struggle and so on and so forth. But believe me, I'll be very happy to talk about that. But that's the rational choice of a left vocabulary which comes out of the 19th and 20th centuries to describe what is happening is a door closer. This is what I mean by epistemological performance. We have to change ourselves because of the changed world. In the English version of your conference description, you have used the phrase, I quote, witnessing a resurgence of national selfishness. I think the project of saving Europe, albeit from an outsider's perspective, a Balkan perspective, can be seen as continentalist selfishness. In other words, I am asking you once again to learn from Labour and agree to re-territorialize the subject of the Balkans with its history. Learn from your history, your past, as you speculate about your future, the Balkans desiring Europa. I have only one string to my bow, training your imagination for epistemological performance, as I've been saying. Changing the way you know an object, epistemological performance. Changing the way you construct yourself as an object of knowledge. The Balkans looking to save Europa, looking to occupy the subjectship of Europe. Srećko Horvat invites me because he likes my critical position. With this empowerment, I will share this insight again with you this evening. So far, I have only amplified the first 3 sentences of my abstract as follows. The idea of Europe is historically and currently precarious as the basis of any unification, especially your nostalgia about, and I quote you, the old continent. Think of that completely defunct document, which now has, nobody remembers, the beginning of the so-called European Constitution, which was, of course, for economic expediting, but it pretended that it was ideological. And the entire beginning was a picturing of Europe as if it could rely on its imperialist past to present itself as an already achieved ideological haven. That's how the old continent saw itself. It's an abdication of epistemological performance, if you like. So I go back to my abstract. The idea of Europe is historically and currently precarious as the basis of any unification. The Latin Middle Ages do not offer a good example. That's the past of united Europe. Monocultures are always in a double bind. In order to think Europe as a territory with borders that can negotiate the performative contradictions of the borderlessness of global capital, remember, I read that passage, in order to be borderless, global capital has to preserve borders of a certain sort so that borders are not just frontiers, although in the EU, yes, it is also actual physical frontiers. Again, this can be complicated very much if one brought Africa into the action and if one brought metropolitan diasporics into the action, upper-class diasporics. Anyway, in order to think Europe as a territory with borders that can negotiate the performative contradictions of the borderlessness of global capital, every citizen must rethink the nation as a site of capital management. Is this possible? This is an epistemological performance also. Rethinking the nation not just as a home of nationalism leading to fascism, nationalist selfishness, language-based nationalism, Hannah Arendt-style place which controls statelessness in post-war Europe. These are all ways of thinking which, in globalization and its simultaneity, where everything is modern, and the sequential stories, in Italy, they are thinking of the communism of capital in terms of this simultaneity. They're, of course, talking about the socialism of capital, which Marx coined the phrase, talking about stocks and shares, right? So in that kind of a situation, one really has to think the nation as a site of capital management, because otherwise, if we don't turn this thing around, what we are facing is the absolute savagery of world governance politically. I don't believe in so-called vernacular cosmopolitanisms. That's a joke. That's a middle-class luxury. So the absolute savagery of uncontrolled so-called world governance on the one side, and on the other side, global capital. Not only is it possible to think the nation as a site of capital management, of course it's happening with your workers, your forum, and in Greece. The nation is being perceived as a space of capital management. Economic disaster is training the imagination for epistemological performance, just as a predatory state in Tunisia had produced a general will to listen to the subaltern speaking with his body, Muhammad Bouazizi's suicide. But this kind of epistemological performance, brought about by economic and political disaster, does not last into a general will for social justice for all. Here, because this is basically justified self-interest, and that's a very different thing. Here there is, in the strict sense, no future, in the strict sense, in this kind of justified self-interest. As young workers are offered jobs that will last a few months, or at best a year in Spain, and at worst nothing at all. Strong social movements demanding social justice, as you write in your conference description, are not enough. If you look at the whole world, what comes forward for the social movements generally in a worldly basis is ethnic feudals without feudalism. This is, and it's not recognizable as such. So to an extent, what I'm really talking about is supplementing vanguardism, an impossible project if you want the wonderful stuff that happened at the Balkan Social Forum, a beginning. If you want that kind of unification, not to fall once again into groupuscular conflict and the correct line. What I'm speaking of, they can certainly make the state and the world accountable, strong social movements. But what I'm speaking of is where the citizen can take the state for granted. You asked in your conference descriptions for the transformation of Europe, I quote you, and the creation of another political, social, and economic project across the old continent. Such a transformation can only happen if you attend to such glamorous and repetitive material from an old woman. Selfishness is not, as I said, a political character fault. Underived selfishness not derived from unselfishness. Underived selfishness grounds creaturely life, so that all of that ethical stuff in Levinas, etc., these are idealist ethical systems, where you say that, and they're very humanist, they're not creaturely, where you say that the human being is born angled, is made possible by the other, and so on. Who says so? I mean, this you can say this and then go on to support Israeli politics, as did Levinas. No, the underived selfishness grounds creaturely life, and therefore we have to look at it in a different way. So now I have come to 5 minutes short of 50 minutes, and I'm not going to talk forever. So, because I have a feeling that I may not be speaking about things that are, for you, objects of immediate interest, because you're so focused on the future of Europe. So what I'll do is I will tell you what I'm going to, what I would have spoken of in the next the 3 pages that I have left, and then I would like to be instructed by your questions. Okay, so let us ask ourselves for a moment, what is the performative contradiction of the borderlessness of finance capital? I don't have to tell you what it is. I've already spoken about it, and it's also in the piece that has been included in your up and underground critical theory dossier. So the fact of the capital crossing borders in order to keep borders intact. This is, in fact, the performative contradiction. If there were no difference between nation-states, state-based currencies further divided by the global north, this G20 and the global south, currency speculation, such as practiced, for example, by George Soros, would not flourish. These virtual electronic divisions are added to more conventional borders so that capital can travel across borders in a digitally borderless fashion. And so on. Capital cannot let go of massively underpaid labor with no workplace safety or benefits requirement, while this kind of borderlessness must be exercised. It is within this performative contradiction that the entire problematic of immigration is lodged. I'm trying to bring together the complete border patrol, southern state of Arizona in the United States, and border studies in Africa, because one has to really know this in the context of what's happened to capital today. Yet racialization and sexualization must also deport migrant labor. So here, racism and sexism is, sexism saying these migrants come in so that they can drop babies. The migrant women can drop babies inside the United States. They're making US citizens. And the racism, of course, is saying what you all know, these so-called undocumented illegal immigrants. But on the other hand, this is a real performative contradiction, because this borderlessness of capital needs these migrant populations, and so there is a contradiction there. Capital needs to keep soft currencies soft. Labor must therefore cross frontiers, not borders, undercover, where hard currency beckons with the hope of a future for their children under capitalism, which is a joke. And yet we must imagine a borderless world of unconditional hospitality. That's the thing that I'm talking about, so that you don't let the practical sense of your problems get into a conflict with the much longer-term, unglamorous and somewhat boring, reformist-seeming task of teaching epistemological performance. It cannot just be done by enthusiastic teach-ins. Believe me, you're talking to someone who was a major player during the 60s. Okay, so I'm not going to go... Yes, now it is exactly 50 minutes. Let me just say that I go back now to my abstract to conclude, where I say that I believe it is possible for us to rethink nation as a site of capital management if education makes the appropriate changes and this shift is understood as both poison and medicine, depending upon its collective use. Future can then be seen as part of the gamble to supplement this shift away from the nation thinking to capital management thinking. The incalculable element of languages must be taken with the utmost seriousness. This is particularly apposite in the Balkan context. My essays have been translated into, separately, both Croatian and Serbian. These problems exist elsewhere. One thinks of Mandarin and Cantonese. I can read Urdu if it is written in Devanagari. The idea of the communism of capital, I already spoke about it, coming out of Italy, makes it clear that the ownership of the means of production does not mean what it did in the 19th century. Small business is no longer an unquestioned good, it never was, when venture capital regularly promises global connections, and as quickly and as broadly as possible. Only this morning, I got a notice from Acumen about patient capital, and it says there, very few impact investors are willing to support early-stage, unproven models of really kind of creaky small businesses coming out of very poor areas. And it goes on to say, addressing this gap is one of the most important opportunities in our sector. Some years ago, and this is where women's microcredit is also launched. Some years ago, I spoke about the fact that Women's World Banking, which gave microcredit to women, said that this was a huge untapped commercial sector. And this, again, today, and I should tell you in conclusion that a person like me, because I have those schools, is approached regularly, and then there's disappointment from the other side. The woman, Jacqueline Novogratz, who founded Acumen, used to work for the Rockefeller Foundation, where I used to be on selection committees, and they knew that I had schools. And so she came to me one day and she said, could you please teach me something about philanthropy in, there was the words global south were not there then, philanthropy in the third world. So I said to her, Jacqueline, I have nothing to say because I don't do philanthropy. I'm very interested in supplementing vanguardism. It's the largest sector of the electorate in a so-called democracy. I mean, they have one vote, I have one vote. Their votes are bought and sold. And if you can't bring intuitions of democracy into that sector, that's what I do. I teach. I teach exactly in the way that I teach at Columbia, where I try to change a little bit, rearrange the desires of the superpower above, who are into kind of helping the whole world by uniting and so on. So she went away thinking, well, Gayatri Spivak, useless, too blazing red. And then she founded this acumen thing. And today, after so many years, I'm beginning to see she certainly has learned how to do philanthropy I couldn't have taught her how to do philanthropy, the capitalist globalization of the poorest of the poor as they, deluded, are walking in to establish these small businesses. So to an extent now what can happen is metaphors can now be negotiated as literal truth on the most pre-critical opposition of truth and lie. Now, there was some more stuff here, but, and no, there was something that you should be very grateful I'm not reading it, okay? Because everybody always complains that nothing Spivak says is understandable, okay? I mean, my friend Nikita Dhawan, I wonder why. Nikita Dhawan was just in Zurich, apparently, and she had praised some of the stuff I said and thought, and she said, someone, as usual, put up their hand from the back and said, well, whatever Spivak writes, of course, is completely incomprehensible. So I thought that I would actually close with my speculation on the old fight of subduing Byzantium as Greece is leaving and Turkey is entering, beginning from Thrace all the way into the new foreign minister of Turkey, taking in Bosnia and so on and so forth, because he has this kind of Osmanli nostalgia now. If you have a nostalgia for the old continent, here is an older nostalgia. And so I was going to give you some truly impenetrable paragraphs written like a literary critic, very poetic. Remember, poetry is also hard to understand. So that, at least I'm sparing you. But that's what would have been the last sector of the piece, some stuff about subduing Byzantium, the old narrative of Ottoman envy. So I'm not going to say that. All that I have said is expatiated on my abstract, and I have suggested that in this wonderful time when you are actually, through your forum and otherwise, wanting to think about the future of Europe and coming together as a post-socialist European left against privatization, remember the unglamorous task of nurturing the will for social justice, not just in the resistors or the vanguard, but in just anyone in the habit of mind that becomes common sense. Thank you.
I think I will open the first round of questions with a question of my own, and it will have to do with India. And my question is, India is, in India's constitution, the preamble, it says that India is a socialist country. And there are many laws in India that are colonialist leftovers. And except for that, India has many parties that are supposed to be communist or Marxist. So, for example, there's the biggest one, Marxist-Leninist. There's also Marxist, Leninist, and Maoist. And on the Maoist party members, there has been an open action of Green Hunt operation, which allows everyone who sees a Maoist on the street to kill him on sight. So, for example, okay, that's one issue that I would like to open. The other is the differences in literacy in southern India and, for example, eastern India. So there's Kerala that is usually listed as the most successful socialist state in India, with literacy over 80%. But in the rest of the states in India, for example, Bengal, the literacy is 30%. But also in Bengal, a Marxist party is in government. So, no, or was?
That's what I was talking about.
Yes, okay. Thank you for the correction. So if you could please, I think in Croatia, there's a lot of mystification about India, and it's always the other something that is exotic, and the materialist perspective of India is very low. So people in Croatia don't really know much about India. They see it as one country that is united. They don't see it as a country that is very similar to European Union in number of languages and in cultural differences. So there are many different traditions in India. Some of them are Dravidian and other Indo-European, and there are also tribal traditions. So there's also Hinduism. Okay, so let me stop here, and if you could comment on some of my questions, and then maybe we should ask the public to also ask some questions.
Thank you. You are an Indologist. I'm only an Indian. So, I'm not a specialist on India. You don't become a specialist on India by being born in India. As for Maoists being killed at sight, I think you should ask Arundhati Roy. I don't know. I haven't seen a Maoist being killed in India, and I haven't seen the law. I mean, the people are killed constantly. I mean, but it's the kind of killing which it would be convenient. You remember what I said? I said the choice of a rational choice left vocabulary in order to describe what's happening, violence on both sides. It's an easy out. How would you recognize that if you see a Maoist on the street? Does a Maoist have a tail? So the thing is, the places where I work, those states, Birbhum is the name of the district, it's within that compass of the so-called Maoist movement. It is completely true that the subaltern population, with absolutely no possibility of anybody on either side listening to anything, do indeed kill. Finally, that's the only solution that's left. They killed the government officers who, in those areas, who have been absolutely against helping. And, you say that the 1947-49 Constitution had called itself a socialism with a mixed economy. That, of course, changed in 1991-92, as you know, in the new, the person who is now our Prime Minister, Manmohan Singh, who used to be See, I know these things because I'm a passport holder. I don't know anything about Indian, specialist knowledge of India. But as an Indian, I have to know about this. So when he was then the finance minister, and he opened the country to so-called development, and it's very amazing that Amartya Sen has written a book called Development as Freedom. It just shows how far he's moved to the center. But at any rate, at that point, India was certainly not, the central government certainly was no longer socialism with a mixed economy. All of the protectionist stuff of the Nehruvian economy were removed. But to go back to the Constitution, first of all, remember what I said about constitutionality today. And I can't just become an information retrieval person because Croatia doesn't know anything about India. You should read books. But, I can't come here to give information about India to you when you're talking about the future of Europe. But at any rate, to come back, in the Constitution, there are also so-called scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. These are groups that supposedly were on a quota system, and in the lowest levels, people want very much to be in these areas with the Aboriginals who were there before the Indo-European speakers came in, and also the so-called untouchable lowest castes, because they will get more money sanctioned from the government because there's a quota. And then having gotten this money, they don't use that money for that's why I say it's not just because Indians are corrupt. I think that's a racist point of view. The Scandinavians are not corrupt, but Indians are corrupt. Who told you that? Have you seen what's happening in the alien laws as the Rwandans and the Somalis and so on are? And you saw what happened in Norway. So let's forget about that particular racist suggestion that somehow we shoot to kill and we are corrupt. But, and this is why I said that the behavior of selfishness is the grounding behavior of, I wasn't even thinking about India, of creaturely life, so that you have to do, we had no practice of freedom when we got our negotiated independence. So that's a different story altogether. So at any rate, because of that, and the very people, the Aboriginals and the outcasts, my students' parents, my teachers, they will say, here is a bridge. There's nothing, of course. Here is a school building. There's nothing, of course. They got the money, but they didn't do anything. Now, that's a very different kind of thing from putting them together and saying that they're Maoists. Most of them, in fact, don't even know who Mao was or what Maoism was. They've certainly never heard of the Little Red Book. So it seems to me that as an Indian, not as someone who's reporting on these movements, in my neck of the woods, I get early in the morning a cell phone call. Sister, there was a little disturbance in Rampur Hat, but nobody killed anyone. Or a warning saying, don't take the evening train because there have been some killings. But the killings were like party killings and goon killings, and also this kind of killing of low-level government officers who don't do anything with the constitutional quotas. So to an extent, if you want to say that this is Maoism, then I think you need to go and look at the investigative reporting that happens and question the bases of investigative reporting. Now, what you wanted to know about literacy in Kerala and West Bengal, I'm not sure. But it is certainly true that the literacy figures are not impressive in India. And to an extent, I don't believe that literacy and numeracy by themselves are a great good. If literacy and numeracy by themselves would be a great good, then capitalist leaders would not be thieves and criminals. So to an extent, what I try to do is work at training for education rather than, and it's also true that the state manufactures statistics for literacy and numeracy, and I can tell you, this would be boring, but I can tell you from my experience how that is done. So therefore, what can I say? Yes, Kerala is more literate than West Bengal. Therefore, Amartya Sen loves Kerala. On the other hand, it is also true that the Vice-Chancellor at Mahatma Gandhi University in Kottayam is being hounded for political reasons. So it's not, I'm not really here either to justify India. As a citizen of the Republic of India, I'm deeply critical of it. And just as a resident of the United States, I'm deeply critical of it. I think it's the obligation of a humanist intellectual to be critical of this is our function. But on the other hand, I also find it uninteresting to give information on a place like India when supposedly we are talking about the future of Europe. I would recommend that you read a journal called the Economic and Political Weekly, which comes out every week and is amazingly interesting in terms of information all the way from women's movements into state policy. It's also online. I think that would be a much better source of information than I could be.
Thank you. I was hoping for some more socialist analysis, and the data that I elaborated weren't here to show off my ontologist knowledge, but to give a sort of, or to try to give some sort of a perspective. So the question was, how is it possible for a country with so many Marxist or socialist parties to have so big differences in social rights, in economic basis of the different communities? And as far as Maoist movement, it was supposed to be one of the social movements that is growing, as I hear. And the other thing is that there are different reports coming from India about Maoist movement and many other social movements. So as Subversive wasn't just about the future of Europe, but it was also about Balkan Forum, and it was also about trying to build a social movement. So I thought it would be interesting for people here to hear something about some of the social movements that are growing in India.
Okay, let me say, socialist analysis, that was what I was saying about the 1991-92 change of the entire economy. Parliamentary left. Now, I've been involved with the Frontier Group, which is a left-of-the-left critique of the parliamentary left. The fact of it's not the left that we're looking at, it's the parliamentary that we're looking at there. And so it seems to me that the idea that there are Marxist parties doesn't necessarily mean that this is why I was saying also what I was saying about the will to social justice. Once you begin to look at the way in which these, and now, of course, the alliance itself is completely immaterial because of what I was saying, that was indeed a socialist analysis of the nature of globalized capitalist globalization. I mean, I mentioned the name of Amit Bhaduri, and I was saying that one needs to have a certain degree of epistemological performance so that one does not think about the analysis of a place like India, India Rising, the metonymic India and China stuff, does not think it in terms of these tired ideas that if you have Marxist parties, there will be social justice. Look at Central Asia. Look at Central Asia. What I was trying to talk about was the idea of no practice of freedom and names of I mean, I just got a notice yesterday about the Anti-Deutsche in Germany, who call themselves the radical left. And again, I was obliged to say that this is a label. So therefore, a socialist analysis of why that's what I was offering, of why all of these parliamentary left parties have not brought about anything like the social justice in the country. That is also related to the thing that I said, that there is nothing at all to, even on the Human Development Index, for your own children, you want the quality of education. On the Human Development Index, you want how many years of education. So that's why the idea of offering a socialist analysis of why many parliamentary left parties have not brought into the Indian Union a state, a country where one would find some kind of social justice. To an extent, if you like, the deep background of my talk was based precisely on that post-colonial complete disappointment. The beginning, we who were the first adolescent post-colonial generation after the negotiated independence, used that phrase ironically, because the failure of decolonization started not only in the non-socialist parties, almost the day that so the colonial laws, yes, there are colonial laws. To an extent, this is why also right at the beginning I said one needs to look at laws and not call them by the label reformist. I didn't make myself clear. I was saying over and over again that one must not have this kind of idea of terminology taken from the 19th and 20th centuries in order to provide a basis for this kind of tired analysis of nation states, because we're not talking about nation states anymore. And I also said that in post-socialist space, the situation is somewhat different. So I think if you really had wanted a socialist analysis of the Indian subcontinent, you should have invited someone who has not been living in the United States for 50 years. I work in India as a very focused person, a teacher who teaches, gives her time and skill, about 4 semesters worth of time and skill in a year. That is enough. I don't particularly agree with those who offer socialist analyses of the Indian Union for some sort of rational account. This is just what I was saying. You know, I encountered Ramachandra Guha in Copenhagen last year, and he was giving his analyses, and I said, you know, I don't agree with this at all. So he says, why don't you, how can you disbelieve political scientists? And I said, yes, I can, because in terms of what I do, if I were a sociologist, you would call it an intensive case study for 30 years. That's how. I haven't seen another urban radical in those spaces. So what you hear from me as an Indian is a kind of very focused activist's account, not a political analysis. I am a literary critic, and I do not live there day to day. I'm associated politically, as I say, with the Frontier Group for many, many decades, which now is really useless because the parliamentary left doesn't have any meaning anymore, because the parliament doesn't have that much meaning. As I was saying, constitutionality is not really what, I say this in the US, I say this in India, is not what is making India rise. As India is rising, the bottom is falling off like a rocket, and that's where I'm focused. I'm not the person capable, you were quite correct, I'm not capable of offering an analysis that would be satisfactory in its outlines.
Thank you very much for the clarifications. If there are questions from the audience, there is one upstairs. On the right, the woman in the white shirt.
Oh, she's coming.
Thank you. Good evening. So I would actually like to ask you something which is not a social analysis or anything of the sort, but actually you talked about imagination, and you talked about an idea of selfishness, which I would like to ask you to elaborate or to imagine a little bit more on, because I think that's actually one of the crucial breaking points between the left and right camp and how you define it. Because, like, in my mind's eye, there is a very firm demarcation line between being selfish and actually taking care of yourself, which actually enables you to take care of your environment, showing personal responsibility, which enables you to show social responsibility. And I think that one of the ironic things in our times is that one of the huge beauty industry corporations actually stole that idea of taking care of yourself. L'Oreal with Brini o sebi, take care of yourself, that idea is very commercially exploited. But I think that it's something which actually touched something in me when you talked about it. It's when I see it as, you know, when I think about what is the potential for social change, I always see it in an individual, in a healthy individual, which actually does take care of herself or himself, and then is able to take care of and, you know, have a vision of a healthy society. But I would like to actually ask you, you know, how you imagine and what meaning you actually put in this word selfishness. Thank you.
Okay, where were you? Where were you standing? Just give me a hand movement somewhere. Where were you? In the back there, okay. Because I like to see who I'm talking to. The selfishness, you know what? It's not a word I use. It's a word that was in the English translation of your conference description, national selfishness. So therefore I picked it up. I said that underived selfishness is grounds creaturely life. I was trying to be as precise as possible. I don't know how this is getting translated, but underived selfishness grounds creaturely life. And the word selfishness there was a quote from your conference description. When I said underived, you see, what you were describing is a wonderful thing. I certainly agree with you. It's the goal. It's not just a leftist goal. It's that old European mens sana in corpore sano, which is written all over the universities, etc., etc. Yeah, sure, that's a wonderful goal. But when I said underived selfishness, what I meant was this idea of selfishness, grounding selfishness, and that selfishness is a bad moral kind of word. I don't want to really give it that moral significance like your parents telling you not to be selfish and so on. But I was taking that word from the description and using it in sort of a catachrestic way, if you like, underived selfishness, which is not the opposite of unselfishness and so on. It's not a right or left characteristic or anything. The need, the will to live and so on, all of this stuff. I mean, you know, people say that even parents are wanting to really preserve their children and so on because of a certain kind of humanism. This is Sophocles' Oedipus talking in the play, a passage which has been for thousands of years mistranslated because they don't know how to make. They thought Sophocles was supporting the law, including Freud, when Sophocles was in fact questioning the law. And his Oedipus says this thing about if I were an animal, there would have been no sin. So to an extent, the idea of underived selfishness, which I just made up right now because I was reading the description, was to suggest that it is not possible to say that, which is a kind of liberal idea, that if you are on the left, then you are necessarily someone who wants to live in such a way that you protect your environment and so on and so forth. This is a learned idea. It's a good learned idea. But even when it is a learned idea, you will see that it does not necessarily percolate into every detail of your life. I have very strong environmentalist friends who really do work, and I myself am deeply involved in ecological agriculture, and I could go on talking about it at great length if there were time. But these friends, for example, I've written about this, they forget to turn off lights. They are happy. They ask me, Gayatri, why aren't you taking a cab when they're abroad? Because they have to get from place to place and so on and so forth. These little details are nothing. They use Post-its all the time for everything and writing on it with ink pens and so on, not realizing that the number of resources that are taken up with 3M Post-its, in fact, make my own students' parents go off as migrant labor, come back with venereal disease and so on and so forth, and so the students, the children, are not taught. So I'm not suggesting that my environmentalist friends are bad people, but when it becomes a habit of mind to be, in an unglamorous way, thinking about social justice for all in this way, in the detail of one's life, one is not necessarily just being a good leftist person as opposed to the bad rightist person. This is the point that I was trying to make. I wasn't saying that human beings are naturally selfish. I was talking about an underived selfishness as the grounding character of creaturely life, not just even human life, because I'm not, in fact, at the end of the day, a humanist. I hope I've answered you, but this is the kind of answer that one has to discuss one-on-one because it's deeply counterintuitive, and I think that's my problem. I'm much more a classroom teacher than a one-shot deal lecturer, and most of the things that I'm saying seem, on the face of it, not exactly correct from within the euphoria of political excitement.
Questions? Srečko.
Okay, since I'm not there, I'm here, Gayatri. Here.
Yes, I see you.
I'm waving, yeah.
I see you.
So since I'm not there, I actually have one question, and I hope it will not turn out like last year, which was pretty difficult for me. During the last week, we discussed a lot about the current situation in Europe and also parliamentary democracy. So among other topics, we discussed also the big success of the left, extreme left, we could say so, but cum grano salis regarding this extreme, about the left party, Syriza in Greece, which got like 70%. So my question is, you said you're not satisfied with parliamentary democracy or with political parties. My question is actually, but is it enough to occupy? We've seen in Greece they've been on the streets for 3 years or even more and so on. And if Syriza wasn't there, probably the Golden Hoe, the other fascist party, would get even more % of the votes. So my question is, shouldn't we use both direct democracy and parliamentary democracy? I mean, yeah.
Yeah, Srečko, I was talking about the assumption that many parliamentary left parties assured the possibility of social justice in a country given over to globalized capitalism. I was talking about India. No, again and again I was making a distinction between different situations. These things do not exist in a vacuum. You cannot say that a party by itself assures something. In this sense, I am, as I said right at the beginning, much more like Gramsci, not the Gramsci who's dismissed in Italy because he's either too liberal or liberal in the US sense or too communist, but the Gramsci who teaches us in his notebooks or journals, whatever you call the quaderni, that everything depends on training people to use something. Of course I'm interested in Syriza in Greece, and of course I'm interested in the situation of right and left parties and the situation of being able to choose between them, casting a vote. But I am more interested in what happens afterwards. I'm not interested in the time of crisis. I'm a useless person from that point of view. In the time of crisis, in a short-term situation, I am an inveterate voter for, that's why I said I vote in West Bengal. I don't vote in Noida. I don't vote in the United States. No, I'm absolutely for. I think participatory democracy or direct democracy is an illusion. I'm not there, no. What I was talking about to the occupiers was that just a national electoral politics at this stage, and there's a huge difference between the United States and Greece today. So therefore, I was saying to them that it's not enough just to win Obama again away from the absurd Republicans. No, I'm of course interested in, but parliamentary democracy can be, in the Gramscian sense, both medicine and poison. That's what I was trying to say. If you look at how it operates in the US, where when everything is under control, read Bruce Ackerman's book called We the People. He's not particularly on the left, it's 2-volume. He lays out how it is possible for a parliamentary democracy to have no engagement from the people, so that only at times of decisions coming down from the Supreme Court do the people get interested out of self-interest, and that therefore anything and everything can come to pass. Remember where I began. I began by saying that the state is our weapon. We cannot be completely against the state. And what kind of a state can we think about? Not an absolutist state or a one-party state. No, we have to think about, in the United States, it's basically a one-party state. It's 2 capitalist parties. But nonetheless, it seems to me that we have to think about the fact that the system, the voting system, is used by a polity that has to be educated rather than only interested or informed. And in a time of crisis, yes, of course, this is important. That's why I said that Greece is able to think about the state as a site, the nation as the site of capital management. No problem. No, Srečko, I'm totally with you there. Of course one can't just throw it away. And no, I'm not for participatory democracy. And I said right in the beginning, the occupying space is virtual. It's not symbolic in the Georges Sorel sense, but it is in a post-revolutionary sense. In a place like the United States, occupying space is virtual. It's not real, so that the defeat or success of Occupy Wall Street cannot be gauged as the newspapers gauge it in terms of could they bring the city, could they close up the city? No, I'm for the state. That's where I began by saying I was for the Frankfurters, because they had talked about a democratic state with its minimum responsibilities. I'm glad you brought it up. I'm not against parliamentary democracy.
Okay. Is there any other question? There is.
Thank you very much for the excellent lecture, really. I would be very happy to know your opinion, actually, about the indigenous autonomy throughout Latin America, without idealizing them, but referring to that they have a completely different agenda, completely different approach, completely different way of decision-making, etc. Thank you.
I don't know much except Bolivia. You know, so I will focus my answer. Is that all right? Because, you know, just as I said that in post-socialism, these things don't exist in a vacuum. You can't just bring up parliamentary left, etc. I said in Bolivia itself that I find social movements, you know, self-selected moral entrepreneurs, I don't find them all that interesting. Extra-state collective action of that sort. I mean, they're wonderful things. But the international civil society is, for me, nothing much. On the other hand, in Bolivia, this was a completely different situation. You remember that the vice president in that article in New Left Review had suggested that it was the revolutionary epoch that Marx had suggested, etc. If you go back to that essay of Marx's, which was written after, I think, the 1854 Spanish Revolution or something, you would see that obviously he didn't know anything about social movements, did he? I mean, how could he have? They didn't exist. Whereas what we see in Bolivia is a complete reversal of the general behavior of social movements. It really is different. I went into, as much as I could, into the countryside to see the various indigenous parties at work and how the indigenous majority was working without the kind of identitarianism that brings down indigenous parties in places where the bourgeoisie is more or less repressive or tolerant towards indigenous parties. It means the same thing. So in my experience, the Bolivian example is a shining example where the certain kinds of focused, for example, the water business in Bolivia, certain kinds of focused social movements can indeed work to support a strong socialist commitment. I found that to be very true. And I think, therefore, indigenous movements in Latin America are very different from, let's say, indigenous movements in Africa. What would indigenous movements in Africa be? An indigenous movement in Africa can very well nourish a Mugabe, but that is not the case in, let's say, Peru or Guatemala or I know less about these places and more about Bolivia. So I would agree with you. Is there anything you would like to add? Because you probably know more than I do. You sure? Okay, so that's my feeling.
I have just 2 short questions. I'm here.
Up here.
Okay. What do you mean by the statement that by the end of the day you're not a humanist? And what sort of declaration or identity actually is being a humanist? And the second one, what do you think about feminism as a contemporary movement? Is there any?
Well, when I said at the end of the day, I'm not a humanist, it's that to make, I was really talking about human racism. Human racism, which has used the world's resources as if the world existed for human beings, that is a position now in question, number one. Number two, in, let's say, 40 years ago, when this was not available to the general consciousness, I mean, there were still people who were working very deeply against that sort of behavior, but the general leftists didn't know about this. At that point, one was not a humanist because of the person who was the human being at the center of traditions of humanism, the straight, white, Christian man of property. And so, therefore, then humanism was like written like this, okay, within quotes. And in India, also, one could say that it was the caste Hindu who was the human being. So, to an extent, those were the reasons. And what I like to do is point out, however, that to be a post-humanist, which is a phrase that is much in use all over the world now, among intellectual ecologists of a certain sort, it's not so easy to be a post-humanist, because even when I try to intuit what is outside of the boundaries of the human, creaturely, I said, I'm obliged to intuit it within a kind of human mind programming. Therefore, I said at the end of the day, I have to keep in mind that that's my methodological boundary, that I have to think in terms of this programming, even when I want to imagine a creatureliness which I share outside of the human community. Feminism as a movement. I think feminism as a movement, if it were a single issue, it would not be, it has never been a good thing. On the other hand, everything I say can immediately be contradicted, because I'm a practical person, and I'm not theorizing here. I think theorizing also is a practice. And so this is why people find me so difficult sometimes. It's not a theory we are thinking rather than producing theories that other people will apply, not having made them. I don't think so. I think the production of evidentiary syllogisms, everybody knows what a syllogism is. Human beings are mortal. Socrates is a human being, so Socrates is immortal. And then using this as evidence, all human beings are capable of producing these. As to what permissible narratives they use to fit this, women give birth, therefore women are only objects of birthing, therefore women are identified with their reproductive systems. This is a syllogism for the patriarchal system. So it's not that Europe is reason and outside everything is unreason. It's just that even in Europe or the United States or Latin America or wherever, what narrative you fill those evidentiary syllogisms with, it depends on, that's where we engage. So in that kind of a way, I think feminism can be extremely useful, because reproductive heteronormativity is the oldest institution in the world. Capitalists and communists, workers and CEOs, everyone is in a double bind with reproductive heteronormativity. Gender is our first instrument of abstraction. When we want to think difference, the only way we can say heaven and earth, etc., but the only difference that we can materially perceive is the difference in secondary sexual and genital growth between human beings. Race is nothing compared to this particular difference. So, to that extent, one should recognize that this instrument of abstraction with which, plus and minus, societies constructed negotiations between the sacred and the profane. This thing, actually, this instrument of abstraction, all mired in the most concrete thing, blood and guts, this thing encountered the abstract as such, in other words, capital emerging at the end of the 18th century. And then began something called the adventures of something called feminism. And not only in Britain, not only in France. So to an extent, if one looks at it that way, one cannot keep, I would recommend, in fact, since the question of feminism is so complicated, many women say we are not feminists because they think feminists are just sort of Western, arrogant, dominant people. I would recommend a wonderful address that Adrienne Rich, the recently dead lesbian poet, she was a fantastic woman, she gave to the Smith College graduation commencement in 1979, when she talks about brilliant women not being able to do anything for liberation because they had to work following the rules of men. Today's UN-style feminism, the Beijing Platform of Action, UNIFEM, and so on, they can't achieve much because they have to work according to the rules of corporate fundraising. And so Adrienne Rich's thing saying, learn from your history, which is where I began. I didn't say I was quoting Adrienne Rich, but that's what I said, to the sense of the old continent. Learn from your history. That's what she says there. And I would really think that this is a piece that not just feminists, but anybody who wants to save either Europe or the world or anything should read. It's a very wise, wonderful piece of writing that can become one's touchstone. Thank you for your questions. It's a serious and good question. So I hope I answered some. Thank you.
So if there aren't any questions, well, okay, sorry, didn't see you. There was another one here also, but after you go first.
Okay. So first of all, I'd like to thank you for this thought-provoking lecture. I was just wondering, you mentioned...
Where are you?
Oh, here I am. Sorry. So basically, if I got you right, you mentioned that identity is not your color of your skin, race, nation, or religion, but rather a civil society you inhabit. Isn't this sort of catchy phrase a little bit ignoring this identity is framed by the skins, race, and particularly religion and notion that are actually sort of created the civil society in the first place? And does this mean that if you are not a member of any civil society, that you have no identity whatsoever? Thank you very much.
I'd like to think that. Yes, you're right, of course. Of course you're right. You called me provocative, and it was a provocative statement. I was actually taking on everyone who thinks that, you see, because the placing within, there is so much, let me say, everything is situational for me. I'm really not someone who gives like universal rules that you can apply across centuries and across space. Therefore, this is a situational complaint because of the extraordinary power of the hyphenated metropolitan diasporic claiming ethnic identity. And in the Global South, the World Forum activist, benevolent, feudal identitarians claiming ethnic identity. I find this to be a very dangerous thing. So this is why I said it in a provocative way. But of course you're right. When we in fact cannot live without thinking that we are. And the I amness is provided by those kinds of details by me and by other people. And so the self-anthropologization before anthropology ever came into being is what gave the difference between ethnos and ethnikos. That, of course, it's true. But I wanted to provoke someone like you into asking that question. I'll tell a little story and then I can hear the other questions. My mother, who was a very wonderful intellectual, she was a Bengali widow, short, looked like spoke with a strong Bengali accent and so on and so forth, but she had an American passport. And because she was my brother's dependent. And so when she and I traveled together, of course, I was the one who was being invited by these states to give lectures and so on and so forth, but of course mother sailed through with her American passport, whereas with my passport. And so I would say to my mom, Ma, you go through and you wait for me, okay, because it'll take time. And so then I would be asked the question, do you have any relatives in this country? I say, yes, she's right across there, sitting there waiting for me, okay, I do have a relative, let me go. So to an extent, this difference, the amount of suffering if you're carrying a passport that is different, that's what made me talk about identity is the civil society to which you attach yourself. But no, I did not mean to say, how could I, that, racialization, sexualization, self-anthropologization, as well as being anthropologized by others. You are determined by what you are. Even sort of good friends saying, oh, yes, you get up so early. Indians get up very early. Yes, you know what I mean? So this is what I was rebelling against. But you're right. I shouldn't really make statements of that sort. So
it's 11 o'clock. If you're in a mood for the final question.
Sure.
Yes, here.
Here. Don't ask a nice question, okay? It's the last question.
Very nice. Okay, thank you very much. I have a question with regard to the issue of education. Early on you were talking about the concept of training for education. So I was wondering if you can explain briefly the concept you use in your classes in India, and if that is similar to what Paulo Freire was using in Brazil when he was opening the school for impoverished people in Brazil. Because to be honest, I found this term training for education a bit patronizing, because somehow it implies a one-way flow of information and knowledge, and not what Freire was talking about, like a just problem-posing concept of education where people would freely talk to each other about the pressing issues. Thank you.
Okay. Not paternalizing, maternalizing. Okay, keep it feminist. But listen. What can I tell you? What do I use? No, it's not Paulo Freire. It's not pedagogy of the oppressed, because there is no conscientization involved here. I would find that difficult to do, precisely because of what you're saying. I don't use a concept. It's undoubtedly concepts get used, but the difference between me, metropolitan, intellectual family, plain living, high thinking, super educated, but not, and taught us to despise the rich, and grew up in Calcutta, and these fellow Indians is so big because of millennial class apartheid. The European colonialism was just day before yesterday, but this is like thousands of years, and we are the caste enemies of these people, bringing them up for manual labor, forbidding intellectual labor, punishing intellectual labor. Problem solving in this situation is too American. When you have actually done this kind of cognitive crime over thousands of years against groups, what you do is you take away the right to abstraction and to analysis. I can't give you examples right now because that would take too long. I was reminded that it's 11 o'clock. But let me say this, that I have been making mistakes there since I began in 1986. And I am trying to learn from my mistakes. I don't run the schools. The schools are run by these people. I train the teachers, and of course I also pay the salaries, but that's because I have to pay them if they're teaching. Someone has to pay them. So that's why. And because the money is okay, but that's not where it's at. It's $1 salary, I don't have children and so on. But I don't like private sector voluntarism, but the state has so-called compulsory primary education, which is nonsense. So that is also, so the attitudes that are in place are old attitudes before, somewhat changed by colonialism, but really the old, thousands of years old attitudes, also in the subaltern, who accept their wretchedness as normal. So you see, it's not a situation where you're teaching them to resist and fight or anything like that. I'm trying to teach the state curriculum in a way that is going to be that is going to open up in the way of teaching the intuitions of democracy that I was talking about. That is to say, ipseity as well as alterity. The uncoercive rearrangement of desires is what I say outside. But once I'm in there, I don't know what I'm doing. Because this is why I've never written a book about these methodologies, etc., because if I started thinking about how I would transcode this for my academic or activist friends and colleagues and so on, I would not be focused on trying to learn how the hell to do this when, in fact, equality does not mean sameness. These are historically damaged by us, people who are equal to me, but I cannot go in with the idea of the human mind resembling the middle-class mind. You know what I mean? And I can't go in with the idea of Montessori and hug the kids and conscientization and so on and so forth. I do not have any notions that I go in with. The ones I go in with inevitably prove wrong. On the other hand, I don't romanticize them at all. After 30 years, you can't. So I can't say that much about what happens there. But I think it is also true that I feel very scared about the maternalizing aspect of it. And not only because I feel it, but because they feel it. And it's very, very difficult to, keep a situation. And it's the same thing in the United States. I despise discipleship. You see, I won't name names, but you will see colleagues of mine who are pursued by people who adore them. But I'm not adored by people, thank God, because I seem to be talking about these counterintuitive things. I fight and so on and so forth. I'm not there to please the crowds. So at Columbia, with the children of the superpower, any color, who are at Columbia and they want to help human rights and so on and so forth, I know what I'm doing. I'm trying to share with them the idea that everybody else is destroyed by being from the superpower and they are somehow godlike and not destroyed. This is a false idea. This we can do together because my cultural difference with them is less. Whereas in the Indian context, it's really very hard for me to be able to generalize. It's an old Gramscian lesson that comes to mind, not there, but talking to you. The subaltern is not so easily generalizable. So this is the problem with subalternity, isn't it? That one doesn't want subalternity to last. But so it's a fantastically important question that you have asked. But yes, you talk about maternalizing. I feel that it's something that it's a huge double bind. It's almost, and especially since I'm an older woman and caste Hindu, woman who's giving money, it's a killer combination. You know what I mean? So, but then all the feudal leaders of the social movements will not admit this. I could name them, but I'm not going to, because on the other side are the real bad people. But this is a problem that's not mine alone. Okay? And remember, Paulo Freire went on to the World Council of Churches when he was kicked out. So what is that? Not paternalizing? Keep that in mind.
Thank you very much, and I'll see you tomorrow on the final round table for this year's Subversive Festival.